Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. We've got a great show today. President Donald Trump has been on a tour of Asia, and he met this morning, we are recording on Thursday, with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The U.S. and China have been engaged in escalating economic warfare in recent weeks, so we'll talk about that. Trump rated the summit a 12 out of 10, although to me it looked like their interaction was quite awkward when they were shaking hands. It seemed almost, pretty tense. After that, we'll talk about the Gaza ceasefire, which perhaps no longer deserves the name Gaza ceasefire, since we've seen these repeated outbursts of violence, including major strikes by Israel. And we're also going to be talking about Latin America. We'll get some updates from our Latin America specialist, Joseph Addington, both on the victory of Malaise party in Argentina, and also on the what some take to be a kind of looming regime change war against Venezuela. But first, as I said, Trump has been in Asia this week. He was in South Korea to meet Xi Jinping. There has been a kind of tit for tat economic warfare in recent weeks. I guess the biggest thing that happened on that front was that China imposed these export restrictions on rare earth materials and magnets that are used in a lot of consumer technological goods and also military stuff. That was a response to a dramatic but underreported escalation or expansion of the number of companies included on America's entity list, including a lot of Chinese companies. And that imposes certain restrictions on US companies that are selling to Chinese companies. Reporting on the Trump Xi meeting would seem to indicate that the leaders reached a kind of pause in this tit for tat, that China agreed to buy American soybeans and to take stronger steps to control the illicit export of chemical ingredients used to make fentanyl. Um, and I should add that hovering in the background of this meeting were some important topics that apparently went undiscussed, namely that shortly before the meeting, Trump ordered the Defense Department to start testing nuclear weapons. It's kind of vague what exactly he wants the Defense Department to do. And of course, the issue of China's desire to reunify with Taiwan is always a major point of contention between Beijing and Washington. So, Sumatra, can you talk about the tensions that we've seen in recent weeks in U.S. China relations? Talk about this high profile summit between the two most powerful people in the world. And I'd also be interested to get your take on the semiconductor issue, because obviously the U.S. it has wanted in recent years to restrict China's access to high end microchips that are used in artificial intelligence and in particular AI military applications.
Yeah, so there were three broad issues at stake ahead of the summit. One was the issue of Taiwan. The China hawks in the administration, especially in the Defense Department, have been talking about how Taiwan is a place where they have to put down a red line. That is, the Chinese expansion in Taiwan would infringe on the first island chains, which would totally jeopardize the strategic, balance in Asia, which means you would see other countries essentially bandwagoning towards China, and Guam and other U.S. territories essentially directly falling under Chinese hegemony. Obviously, that has changed. Campaign rhetoric is one thing, but real politics is very different. Even the most hawkiest of hawks, China hawks in the Defense Department, they toned down that calculus before the summit. So far, it appears that the U.S. is going to stick to the old ambiguity about Taiwan, whether it's being defensible or non-defensible. Like, we are not going to comment in public about whether we are going to defend Taiwan. In return, that the Chinese are not going to say in public that whether they're going to attack Taiwan. That doesn't really change the strategic dynamic of the region, but at least it stops the spiral. The Chinese don't have to worry about the U.S. preemptively joining or taking a side and destroying the entire status quo of the last 80 years almost. And the Chinese, obviously, I mean, it might completely change when it comes to conflict, but it gives the United States sort of like a leverage as to which way to pivot depending on the situation at hand. So that's point number one. Point number two was about the question of the Chinese and American G2, whether we would essentially side with some of the countries which are surrounded by China or which are surrounding China, whichever point you want to take, and we would explicitly say that alliances in Asia Pacific are as important as Europe, and regardless of what happens, we will stop a Chinese attempt of hegemony, as Eldridge Colby famously wrote in his book, A Strategy of Denial, to deny China to be a hegemon in the Asia Pacific, being one of the cornerstones of the previous national security strategy. Uh, that seems to be gone. It was kind of sudden how President Trump truth socials and tweeted about welcome to the G2, which is like the biggest, mid 2000s Jan Bremer idea of, a balanced Chinese American, world where like both are almost equal. I mean, that if the president of the United States is tweeting out that welcome to a G2 world is as much a written guarantee of an acceptance of at least a peer rival, or if not a peer competitor in China. China is now officially, technically, a superpower. The US president acknowledged that. So even rhetorically, that changes a lot. And also, I'm curious to see how in the next few months, or at least in the next few years, hedging happens in Asia and Pacific. Like if we say that it is a G2 world, what does that mean? Whether it's a G2 world when it comes to trade and economy, whether it's a G2 world when it comes to physical space and spheres of influence. If that's the case, which side will the other rival powers like Japan, Vietnam, Philippines, and India, Australia, all of these countries will fall? Whether they're going to hedge with China, whether they're going to trade with China, that is something to be seen. But officially, at least, the U.S. president has mentioned that we are now in a G2 world, which means China is technically a peer rival. The third point that you mentioned about chips, there was a lot of talk about the US trading NVIDIA Blackwell chips, which are some of the highest performing chips, because the US was worried about the Chinese having total control on export of every kind of rare earth. Now, rare earths are basically not that rare, they can be found everywhere else. But the processing of those rare earths is essentially a monopoly the Chinese have. We don't really have that kind of processing of rare earths in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere, to be fair. I mean, you can get rare earths from Venezuela, you can get rare earths from Greenland, but to process them is the big thing. Now, processing that and creating some of the best chips in the world, which are guaranteed for our country, that to give that technology away is essentially cutting your own feet in a way. Thankfully, this morning, from so far we know, that the president has mentioned that he hasn't declared that he is going to trade the Blackwell chips. I don't really know whether he actually knows the significance of the chips so far, but that is a positive sign. There was a huge hue and cry in the last few days about whether we are trading chips for soybeans, which sounded like I commented to a friend of mine. It sounded like something like Belarus's Lukashenko would trade, like selling potatoes for technology or something of that sort. But thankfully we are not doing that. What we have done so far, what we have seen, uh, personal charisma notwithstanding, I think it is a Chinese win. I think the Chinese kind of managed to stare down on the United States. They were expecting a hard negotiation where the US put tariffs on China, but then they stuck to their core. They knew what their structural and competitive advantage is, rare earth processing, and they said that we're going to stop all kind of rare earth exports. And the US sort of backed down. So it might not look, like much of a change from the previous era, but essentially, if we are going 11 at the start and then pumping brakes, like that is essentially technically a defeat in this, stare off contest. So I think from that small point, I think the Chinese have won.
Yeah, that's interesting. As I was watching this tit for tat unfold the past couple weeks, and I'll say I think that the Western and especially American media, reporting on this has been really bad. Like China will do something and it's presented as this very aggressive act, that just came out of the blue. It's like in a vacuum when really America has been the primary driver of this economic warfare. I'm not saying, America is sinister. They're trying to figure out how to handle this rising superpower, right? But my read is that China basically responds in a tit for tat way. It's kind of their like go-to move. Um, and what's kind of been interesting is one almost gets the impression that at some point in the last few years, without us fully realizing it, we became more dependent on China than they are on us. And And Trump, I think, is realizing that, like, when he puts these huge tariffs or threatens to put these huge tariffs on China, and then they just change some rules on rare earth materials, and he has to back down. So that's been kind of interesting to see. Um, Joseph, I want to go to you because Sumantra just mentioned this whole thing about these Blackwell chips. Um, And, I think Sumatra put forward the basic, opinion, the common sense opinion among people on on the right who are, like, suspicious of China, and even, just across the political spectrum in America, that it's good that we didn't sell them these chips or approve their getting them. Joseph, I think before our meeting, you said that you're glad we didn't trade, advanced microchips for soybeans or something like that. I wanna I want to introduce a kind of complication, which is, isn't it a good thing if China is dependent on microchips like made by an American company and manufactured in Taiwan? Like, isn't that dependency good? Doesn't that
No, because they always use
well,
it
hold
to
on, hold on,
steal
hold on, hold
American
on. There,
IP.
there there's a deterrence value here because the less dependent China is on Taiwan for their TSMC factory that makes all these chips, or most of the high-end ones, the better. I mean, the worse actually. We want them to be dependent on that because we have a lot of leverage. Like if a war kicked off, we could probably either bomb that factory or we could get our allies in the Netherlands, for example, provides all sorts of chip making, like lithography equipment to TSMC. We could get them to cut that off, right? So if China was dependent on that factory, they would have an incentive not to invade. But if we like encourage them to build their own indigenous supply chains, I think that I'm not saying it's the wrong policy, but I think it's a downside that isn't being considered. What do you think about that though?
First of all, I don't think there's any real, possibility of deterring a Chinese intervention in Taiwan if they want to do so at this point. Whatever you can say about attempting to increase the interdependencies between Taiwan and China, make them more dependent, whatever military steps you want to take, there's no real possibility of deterring China and Taiwan at this point. They have overwhelming force advantage in force projection on the Taiwan Strait, and they have a lot of options that they can use in order to non-destructively exert Chinese will on Taiwan. Something to the extent that they can just blockade Taiwan if they would like to, and in a entirely non-violent way say, if the U.S. you want to intervene, you can come in and break the blockade. And I can almost guarantee that, the United States, if that is something that happens, is not going to go in and intentionally get into a shooting war with China because we would lose. Um, so as far as that goes, I think that boat has sailed. Like, uh, we want what we want to do is make sure that America and China are that America is as little dependent on China as possible. That should be the American approach towards this situation. And so we should avoid selling chips to China. We should avoid whatever short-term
Selling chips
aims
to
that's
China doesn't really make us dependent on them, though. I mean, the dependency would mostly be the other way. And, people like Sumatra was just talking about policies that can affect
well,
the incentives of China.
It increases American market involvement in China, both by selling chips there and having China involved in our soybean
But
market. So
presumably, when you're thinking of the ways that we should reduce our dependency on China, you're imagining ways in which we should make sure our supply chains don't involve China. Like we're not getting goods from China because that's a form of dependency. But this would be a form of dependency that goes the other way. And the reason I think the deterrence value of China being dependent on these chips made in America, manufactured in Taiwan, the reason I'm attracted to that idea, even though I'm not sure it works, is mostly when people are talking about things to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, they talk about things that are actually potentially quite provocative of China, like building up Taiwan's military, basically, because that gives China the impression, oh, if we're going to invade, we better do it soon, right? Or it gives the impression, well, America seems to be using Taiwan as some sort of outpost against us. Whereas this dependence on chips, I think, at least I think Xi Jinping would agree with me at least because even though Nvidia, I think they've been given some permission to make these like H2O chips, which are not quite the highest end ones, and the CCP doesn't want that. Like, even though they'd be allowed to import these chips, they don't want this dependency on this American company, and she's trying to d domestically produce this for the reasons I said. He doesn't want to be dependent on America in this regard. Um, but I don't know, maybe you're right. I agree with you that a boa constrictor blockade makes more sense than an invasion, but I know a lot of people disagree with me about that. They think that China will just go for the invasion. And I think that's possible. But Sumatra, you want to have the last word on this before we go to Latin America?
Yeah, so I think you're both right in some way or the other. One, traditional democratic peace theory says that the more trade you have, the less there are chances of actual friction. So in that way, the more trade we have with China, the less chances of actual war conflict with China. The difference, though, in this case, is we are talking about some of the most advanced technology the world has ever seen, which is in the sole custody of the United States. These are not just generic chips that you could use in like fridges or Broombas. These are the kind of things that would help you in supersonics, in hypersonics, in quantum computers. Those are the kind of things that the Chinese strategic doctrine is lagging behind. If they get those technology from us, eventually they'll be able to take over the companies and they can reverse engineer that. But so far, the fact that we are not giving it to them stops them from actually going toe to toe with the US military in some way or the other. And we are not talking about Taiwan. We are talking about like Africa and Djibouti, for example. Anywhere where there might be a conflict between the US and China or even a confrontation, the Chinese are lagging behind us because of some of the most highest chips that we have. If we give it to them and they can reverse engineer that in the next 10 to 15 years, then that is a disadvantage.
Yeah, I think that probably the best argument against my position is basically the one you just said, where actually we are on the cutting edge, at least of this technology. China has surpassed us in many ways, like manufacturing output, electricity output. They're building way more nuclear reactors than us. But we still have the advantage in this very important thing. It's kind of crazy that that Taiwan of all places is the place where like 95% of the high-end chips are manufactured. TSMC, for listeners who don't know, it's this factory in Taiwan, and its only business model is manufacturing other companies' chips. It just got really, really good at that, and it's proven extremely difficult to replicate its success anywhere else in China or the United States. Both countries are trying, but failing seemingly. Um, yeah, I am worried about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, not because I think it's likely necessarily in the next few years, but because I think it would be like a catastrophic global economic event. But I think we need to move on to Latin America, and I'll shut up a bit. I've been talking a lot. Joseph, there's a lot going on in Latin America every week now. We don't even report on each strike on these alleged drug boats anymore because the cadence has really quickened. Like, I think there will be in a single day, sometimes there'll be like 3 strikes killing like dozens of people or something. Correct me if I'm wrong. We're sending an aircraft carrier. Maybe it's already arrived. I think it's like our most advanced one, the Gerald Ford, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Caribbean. Just talk about what's going on there. We've also had some new reporting. I don't know if you read it on Marco Rubio's role behind the scenes and like pushing for this policy. So what's going on?
Sure. Well, the Trump administration has been consistent in its advocacy for a much stronger U.S. hand in the Western Hemisphere, Neo Monroe Doctrine, and all the rumors say that the new national defense strategy will emphasize yet further the American defense and dominance over the Western Hemisphere. And so Latin America obviously is the majority of that. So what you see is you have a really strong overlap in sort of the defense interests of the MAGA movement and the old style interventionists that are still left over from the old GOP that are ideologically opposed to people like Nicolas Maduro, um, and the strong influence on the right, especially from Florida, which is the state that has the strongest influence in the Trump administration, of diaspora nationalists that are looking to use American power to settle old scores in the region. Um, and so I wouldn't be surprised if this is at least, given Marco Rubio's Cuban roots, I wouldn't be surprised if this is at least part of his interest in the region and in unseating Nicolas Maduro, especially because Maduro does provide significant aid to the Cuban government in the form of supplying them with subsidies essentially through Venezuelan oil, which they need to keep together their power grid, which is just barely functioning, although functioning is a generous word. So you see this confluence here between sort of these two realms of foreign policy, and so you have a very strong. There's a strong pressure in the Trump administration to exert as much pressure on Maduro as possible, leading up to potentially regime change, which is what we see because while the administration has couched the deployment of all of these assets to the region, especially the Caribbean, in the terms of anti-narcotics operations, attacking drug cartels as essentially narco-terrorist groups. I think that everyone is perfectly aware of the fact that Gerald R. Ford class supercarriers, the most advanced naval asset in the world, is not intended or optimized for drug interdiction. Uh,
Yeah, that's usually a Coast Guard activity, not for our
exactly.
top aircraft carrier.
Drug interdiction is something that you use Coast Guard cutters for, small boats that are agile and capable of easily running down and intercepting these sort of fast boats and small drug submarines. They're not terribly dangerous. They're generally unarmed. The difficulty is usually just in detecting them. Once you detect them, it's pretty easy to stop them. Um, Now we've decided to use airstrikes. We blow them up quite a bit with missiles, which, for what it's worth, is not necessarily. Although some people will say, you're blowing up a $500 boat with $1 million missile. They're carrying lots of drugs, so this is not necessarily an uneconomic trade, but it's definitely uh, a new direction for American intervention in narco-terrorism. Um, it can increase the cost of cartels, but I don't know that it will be as effective, definitely as the administration hopes. We have seen in recent days. It used to be that we're blowing up the drug boats only coming out of Venezuela. We have seen in recent days they've expanded that, and now they're blowing up many more in the Eastern Pacific, which is where most of them come. So it looks like this is turning into sort of a generalized approach. But it's definitely being used to put a lot of pressure on the Maduro regime. And the reason that it's dangerous, really, is because once you have this ramp up, as it's almost it's very obviously being used as a way to attempt to push Maduro out of power, either by getting him to step down peacefully, or by attempting to engineer some coup by an internal faction that will overthrow him in response to American pressure. The problem with this approach is that it's almost certainly not going to happen. The only faction inside of Venezuela that's capable of coupping Maduro is the military, and Maduro has very thoroughly and regularly purged the military. Every year he goes through and purges and throws in jail any military officer or personnel that is a potential threat. There's something like 175 uh, 175 of the political prisoners currently in jail in Venezuelan prisons are military personnel because this is something that he's very good at.
Weren't we
So
trying to bribe his pilot or something to fly him here to America? Did you see
I'm
that?
sure that have been all kinds of schemes that, the Trump administration has also apparently, uh, you know, authorized covert actions and put a bounty of $50 million on his head. So we're trying
Mhm.
everything that we can, explicitly acknowledging the fact that we've authorized covert actions is, again, one of those methods to sort of engineer a coup to put psychological pressure on elements of the regime, to induce paranoia because, oh, the CIA might come and get you. Um, but of course, again, the military has been very thoroughly purged, and Maduro is in the strongest position that he can be by not stepping down. Once he steps down and no longer has a military and a government behind him, he becomes a lot more vulnerable to being headhunted for that $50 million. So it's unless the U.S. decides to offer him some kind of off ramp, which, given the tenor of American approach to Venezuela, seems unlikely. It's unlikely that we're going to come forward and offer to cut a deal with him. It would be a major divergence from our approach and might seem weak. Uh, then the question is, well, what do we do if Maduro doesn't want to step down? Are we just going to pack up and say, well, we exerted the full force of like a whole third of the mighty American Navy, and we couldn't even budge some tin pot dictator that ran his country into the ground. We're just going to pack up and go home now. He wins. That seems unlikely, and so it's a very easy road from there to, well, we're going to blow some things up to show who's boss, and from there it's an easy step further into full scale intervention and occupation of the country. So that's the big
Yeah.
issue. The
Yeah, I
other
want
thing, we
to.
can touch on Argentina, but do either of you have any further comments on Venezuela? Because this seems to be, in my opinion, the really big thing that's going on in Latin America, and there's been a lot of discussion about it around DC.
Yeah, this is big, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention this piece that we ran on October 25th. The small boat attacks are illegal by George D. O'Neill Jr. And we've been hearing a lot from not from a lot of Republicans, but from libertarians, especially Rand Paul, about the illegality of these boat attacks. Rand Paul points out, for example, that when the Coast Guard does interdict boats accused of transporting drugs, it has a really high error rate. Only like 25% of them actually have drugs. So he kind of uses that as a baseline number to assume most of these boats are not carrying drugs. We have seen some like semi-submersible boats, like basically submarines being attacked. And I'm a city boy, but from what I understand, you can't go fishing in a submarine. So I assume that that was a drug boat. And then, in the Pacific, that actually is used as a corridor to transport cocaine to America. A lot of the stuff going in the Caribbean goes to Trinidad and then it's shipped to like Europe. But O'Neill in this piece, he just talks about the basic laws governing these kinds of strikes and how he in his argument, the executive branch can't just determine that these are terrorists and that Trump can just by fiat declare a war against them and strike them. He talks about first the U.S. Constitution, how it gives Congress the ability to declare war. He talks about the UN Charter, which it's international law, but it's also domestic law because the U.S. signed and ratified the UN Charter, and it doesn't allow for an attack like this, and unless it's like self-defense against an armed attack. And O'Neill argues that these boats can't plausibly construed to pose like an imminent armed attack. They're doing something illegal, but they're alleged criminals. We're not at war with them. Talks about international maritime law, and it's a really good intro to sort of the laws governing this kind of thing. And he thinks that the war on terrorism really set up the United States to kind of push legality aside, and that's kind of coming back to bite us now. So, Mantra, what do you want to add on our buildup in Latin America and this Venezuela thing?
Yeah, I think the basics of the force posture is something which Joseph mentioned. I mean, we have the biggest four carriers are essentially even bigger than the Nimitz, the Ronald Reagan class carrier. So, like, we have the biggest boats in the world essentially parked to smoke a couple of dozen of people in a dinghy, which is one of the most bizarre things if you think about, like, just genuinely from a war fighting perspective. I'm glad you mentioned George O'Neill's piece. He mentioned in one of the paragraphs a thing about letters of marque. The Congress has got the power, and that obviously struck me because I am an old school libertarian, like coming from the days of Ron Paul, and for the people like us who remember those days, in 2003, when we were planning to go to war in Iraq, Ron Paul came out with a bill that obviously didn't pass the Congress, where he talked about, like, look, from a classical libertarian point of view, or the foundational point of view of this country, in a way, the state has got no right to go to war unless attacked. But the state has got every right to let the market decide. In this case, the letters of marque are, a classic way of dealing with terrorists, for example. You let private companies deal with it. You let, individual privateers to talk about it. And I was thinking of that, and this piece mentioned that, the Congress has got the right to do that, but otherwise it's illegal to just like go without marry. And that struck me as something which we don't really talk about much, as to how the MAGA movement is essentially splitting between a more hawkish, America First, kind of like John Bolton style America First, like we are unilateral, and that's how we are America First. Like the only way we do politics is unilaterally. We don't care about institutions. We don't care even about norms. It's not just about United Nations, but it's about like anything that comes in our. It's a very Boltonian worldview. And the other is the Ron Paul, Rand Paul, Thomas Massey, for example, is a classic example. NTG, in some ways they are not classic libertarians as we would know, but they are still more in connection to their libertarian side when it comes to the questions of war and peace. And I think that is something which we need to think about more after when we read that piece, like, what if you are to be given a thought experiment to figure out how is this current administration different than, say, a potential Ron DeSantis administration? What would be your point of view? Like, what would the tick points in your equation going to be? One, this administration is relatively less pro-Israel compared to Ron DeSantis. Fair enough. But other than that, they are performatively opposed to mass migration without actually doing much to cut down the real issues that would lead to mass migration. For example, they have cut down, issues in the, crossing in the border, but that's not a law. That could be reversed tomorrow if a new government comes. A lot of these things have happened with executive orders, so they're not, much valid for a long term. When it comes to Latin America, they're fundamentally ruled by either, as Joseph mentioned, a bunch of Cubans and expats who want to change their home country's politics, on the back of the U.S. Military, and they're also ruled by a huge Florida lobby. Like, essentially, the top echelon of the Trump administration are all from Florida, and they are the ones who are deciding politics in Latin America, and they're by definition a lot more hawkish than the rest of America, right? So that's there. They are, performatively opposed to wokeism, and like that is their fundamental way of looking at the world. But like structurally, when it comes to trade and economy, it has been a lot haphazard, and essentially we have kind of like fallen back to the old paradigm. Like, we are still doing trade with China. We are not, pivoting to Asia, where we are still stuck in Europe and continuing the conflict in Ukraine. We are still in the Middle East. So, I mean, if you have to really look at a Ron DeSantis administration and a Trump second term administration, there isn't much difference. And that is something which, essentially is going to split the movement, in my opinion, in 2028. Like, fundamentally, a bunch of people who voted for Trump voted more for a Ron Polish kind of foreign policy. But they're not getting that. And that would be a point of contention in the future.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the Gaza quote unquote ceasefire, and there are a lot of potential segues here to that conversation. One, you mentioned all these Cubans in Florida. A lot of people, when you talk about the Israel lobby, um, they'll say it's anti-Semitic, but there are lots of ethnic lobbies, and one of them is the Cubans, and they exert a lot of political pressure historically because, the parties at one point saw Florida as a battleground state. And this was one reason that the Cuban lobby became so powerful. And they tend to be very hawkish on Latin America issues. Um, Another potential segue here is I find it very interesting that this Gerald Ford aircraft carrier, it was in the Mediterranean Sea. It was scheduled to deploy to Europe, and instead it's coming back to the Caribbean. And I wonder here if people in the administration, I mean, obviously Marco Rubio is the prime mover of our Latin America policy, and I don't think he thinks of it this way. But I imagine some people at the Pentagon see a silver lining here of like, this is retrenchment from Europe and the Middle East and focus on hemispheric defense. Because now we just have aircraft carriers in the Caribbean and in Asia. And that's like what Elbridge Colby would want, the Undersecretary of Policy at the Pentagon. Um, I think it almost might also be a signal to Israel, like, okay, if the ceasefire breaks down or if you restart the war with Iran and all of a sudden you got the Houthis in Yemen attacking you again, we're busy over here focusing on the Western Hemisphere. I've been told by at least one military expert that she doesn't think people think of it that way in the administration, but nevertheless, I think Israel will surely notice that that the Gerald Ford left the Med Sea. And then another segue here is, JD Vance gave this. He was at this Turning Point USA conference that was Charlie Kirk's organization, I believe in Mississippi, and he was answering questions. To his credit, unscripted, unfiltered questions. He was just standing up there for like over an hour, responding to students, and a lot of students were asking about Israel. Predictably, young people are like pissed off about our support for Israel, and it's kind of interesting on Latin America and the Middle East. JD Vance, he wants to be like the restraint guy, right? And I think he is genuinely, committed to restraint, certainly more than like Marco Rubio. But it seems to me Marco Rubio is a more kind of active person in the administration driving these policies, and it's kind of putting Vance in a potentially awkward situation. Like, he's got to figure out how he's going to rhetorically handle these issues. And I don't think a question was asked about Latin America, but Surely he's trying to work out how he's going to handle this on the campaign trail in 28. So I'll let you guys respond to either of those points I just made, but just thinking about the Middle East broadly, about Israel, about our desire to retrench from it and our kind of inability to do so, and how this ceasefire is breaking down. What are you guys paying attention to? We'll start with you, Joseph.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the big problems is just the United States continues to be involved in an unstable region that it has little interests in. It's very difficult for us to come to any satisfying solution of Middle Eastern issues because, you know, there are other countries that have so much more at stake in the region. And so, the US can come in and it can try to tip the scales, but ultimately there's not much at stake for us other than sort of our reputation and the internal pressure that comes from various ethnic lobbies, Israel, Qatar, whoever you want to whoever you want to add, the Saudis. There are a whole slew of lobbies that are attempting to exert to use American influence to tip the scales in their favor in the region. Um, and so really the only way for us to have any sort of successful policy in the Middle East is one that's proportional to our interests, which would be minimal. So, in my opinion, the only real way to satisfy concerns about American policy in the Middle East is largely to disengage. Where there, in so many ways, American foreign policy is still stuck in the mindset of 50 years ago. This isn't the 1970s. We don't need oil in the Middle East. Israel is a mature country that's entirely capable of defending itself and should not be, doesn't need the United States to support it. And United States no longer has major interests in helping Israel to obtain or maintain hegemony in the region. So we should just leave.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think they might need us to maintain hegemony, but without our
Well,
support, they'd have
they would need us to maintain hegemony,
Yeah.
but they're capable of defending themselves. They would probably need us to maintain hegemony.
Right.
But it's not in our interests for them to attain or maintain hegemony anymore.
Right. Yeah, Sumantra, I'll give you the last word on Middle East topics. And those things I mentioned, including Vance's kind of awkward political position as I perceive it.
I mean, I don't know what goes on in the in the mind of the vice president. I'm sure he wants to be the front runner for 2028. But like in my almost 12, 15 years of covering politics from a student journalist to now as a policy guy, you have to at one point in time realize that you have to defend something. It's just you can't make everyone happy, and you have to stick a line, and that line might be something which you either don't want to do, or something which you have to do regardless. And in that case, you have to be like go opposed to the principle in this question. So I'd leave it at that. I mean, I'm trying to be as diplomatic as I can in this case, but like in 2028, there's going to be a lot of decisions and a lot of quotes that he's using now that might come back to haunt him, right from the fact that once he touted as the biggest multiracial coalition that he has assembled under Donald Trump, and now, the coalition is not going to last. I can guarantee you that. That is, it's going to be, there's no way in the next 3 years that coalition will last. Nothing we have seen so far from the administration is predicated on tightening that coalition. So on that, definitely he's going to face a lot of issues. Second, on foreign policy, he's going to face a lot of issues. Like Vance is the primary proponent of restraint from the top, in the top 5 in the administration. And I don't think so far we have seen much of defense from his side. The second thing about Gaza, look, I don't consider Israel to be a hegemon. I mean, it's a vicarious hegemon in a way, like it lives on someone else's, hegemony. But I also don't think that the retrenchment that we are seeing from the Middle East is permanent. I mean, it's a ship. So, you can move it back and forth. It's not like you're closing a base in Europe and moving all the troops back. Even then, you can put troops back in Europe. Like I remember, I was young, but when you're doing your PhD, you study the retrenchment that happened from Europe between 93 and 96. In 1993, where there were 333,000 troops in Europe, by 1996, there were 66,000. So you can do a lot of retrenchment within a short period of time. For ships, though, that's a different equation. Like, yeah, your carriers are now in the Caribbean. It takes 6 days to go to the Red Sea. So, it's not a permanent thing. And tomorrow, if Israel restarts a war in the Middle East, is the administration going to say no in defending Israel? Like, I have not seen any evidence so far. When Israel bombs something, and when the counter bombs start falling, the administration is saying like, no, we're not. You're on your own. I have not seen any evidence so far. So I'm not that optimistic about this retrenchment will be permanent. It's a good thing. It should be in our own hemisphere. I would prefer it to be even in Asia in some reasons. Like I park an aircraft carrier in Darwin in Australia. That's fine. But like whether it's a permanent retrenchment, I don't think so. I think the Israelis understand as much as we do that at the end of the day, any political lobby is determinant on a sense of history and demographics. Sense of history is already diluting. We are not in the post-45 world order anymore. The current generation doesn't really care about the post-45 human rights world order. The future generations even more so. They're far, far more right-wing than us. And second, I think at one point in time, you have to understand that even in the diaspora in the United States, the Jewish people in the United States are much more secular compared to Israel. Like their worldview is not the same as Bibi Netanyahu in some ways. Like there is that even in that region of the contradiction. I think one of the strongest right-wing points that I always talk about immigration in the United States is like one thing and one thing only that you should judge people coming to this country is who are coming to lobby for their own birthplace and who are actually coming to settle down in this country. That it's not skin color, it's not language. Language can be taught. If you go and check the Ellis Island people, half of them couldn't speak English. Current people, 83% of them speak English. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What matters is the people who are coming to this country, whether they're coming with the dual loyalty or whether they're not coming with the dual loyalty. That is the only thing that matters. If you're coming to the United States, you assimilate to the local culture. If you're coming to the United States to talk about Qatar or Saudi Arabia or Israel or Pakistan or India, you're never going to assimilate. I think that is the only way you can judge new migrants. And I think that is something which the administration and every administration should care about.
It's just kind of hard to figure out how to vet migrants in that respect.
That is
Because
true.
you can't just be like, give them, ask them, do you have
I mean,
dual
my question would
loyalty?
be like, to me, when I'm coming, if someone asks me, if there's a trade war between the United Kingdom and the United States, who do you support? Simple answer. It should be the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you could say yes, but it's like,
Right.
but no, I get your point. Yeah, let's move on to our picks of the week. I'm gonna go ahead and pick a piece we already have been talking about, which is George O'Neill's "The Small Boat Attacks Are Illegal." It's on our military activities in South America, and a great primer or however you pronounce that small word on the relevant domestic and international laws that should govern that kind of thing. Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
Sure, I will pick Leon Hadar. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. His piece, Trump's Pivot to the Americas, which talks about the administration's Western Hemisphere policy, positives and negatives. Excellent analysis. Great piece. So that's mine. Trump's Pivot to the Americas by Leon Hadar.
Sumantra.
I'm picking your piece, Andrew, on Zelensky's top man is a big problem. We don't really get to hear a lot of the internal criminology of Ukraine. This is very illuminating for those who don't really study Ukraine or, who are not keeping an eye on this equation. Zelensky, when people say that Zelensky is like limited in his choices, they don't really understand just how much pressure he is in on what kind of people are surrounding him. And I think that's a good primer. I think people need to know that after losing power, Zelensky's position might be very untenable. And that is something, a lot of people don't really know in the United States. So your piece is eye-opening in that regard.
Thank you, Sumantra. Yeah, it's not clear that Zelensky's even the most powerful person in Ukraine right now. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. I want to thank our listeners for listening until the end, and I want to thank you, Joseph, and you, Sumantra, for the very illuminating discussion. See you next time.